This is the Jay Show, and this is Dr. Jay Smith here in London. I've invited Sarah Foster to come and really help us with slavery, because this is an area you've been talking about. You've gone to Gambia to actually teach it, the place where really they are dependent on slaves for the whole slave history for their entire industry there. It's an enormous enterprise that their entire country is because of all the African Americans that come there to relive their slave past because of the difficult material that they came out of roots. Now, you've been there, you've lectured, you were there in March of this year, and you have really been doing an awful lot of research because of your own background, Jamaican. Though you've grown up here in England, you've always known that you're a descendant of slaves. And now we're moving into some of the Islamic slavery itself. We're going to actually unpack and go into some of the historical slave trades from the Muslim standpoint. And we're going to look at Europe. This is something that most people don't know about. I didn't know this, that there was actually Islamic slave in Europe. I assumed all the slavery was African. I didn't know that it had any of the Europeans to do with it. But you have found that there is quite a bit of slavery that included white people as well.
So in terms of the European slave trade, we're going to concentrate on the Barbary pirates. Now, these were pirates that were in the waters in northern Africa, in the Mediterranean, up into the British waters as well, and they enslaved up to, some estimates say, over 1.5 million people from Europe. More conservative estimates say between 1 to 1.25 million Europeans were taken this way, but it was just an amazing enterprise. They would go and they would capture ships and they would take inhabitants away. They would have them in their own ships and have them rowing back into slavery, into Morocco and Algeria and all those places there. But they also went inland and actually went into European lands and actually took slaves.
You mean they enslaved Europeans?
They enslaved Europeans. They actually went into their land. So, for example, here in 1627...
We'll put this on the slide up there. So 1627, Iceland.
Iceland was invaded by Barbary pirates. So these are Muslim pirates, so just don't want to make
For
any
those of you who don't know where
about that.
Iceland is, look on a map, you'll see it's way up in the Atlantic. It's halfway between really Newfoundland in Canada and Denmark.
So, Joe, when did Iceland ever enslave the Arab world, or when did they ever attack the Arab world?
Well, I don't know.
There's no record of Iceland going to attack Arabs or going to attack Muslims in the Muslim world, but yet we see Muslims here via the Barbary pirates going enslaving 400 people, and out of that 400, only one of them went back, we find.
Let me just stop you here. Have you ever seen Roots? The documentary that became so popular in America by Alex Haley. The introductory sequence has Europeans coming with cutlasses and enslaving Africans there in their own villages. When they went back and asked Alex Haley where he got this from, he couldn't recall, he didn't remember, but this is what he'd always been told. They said the sociologist there at Chicago University of Chicago, where Alex Haley was, I think he was teaching at that time, or anyways, he had something to do with it. They said, there's not one documented case of any Europeans enslaving Africans. They never did. They always bought the slaves from Arabs. Not one documented case. But you're telling me that actually it's the Arabs that went into villages and did that. This image that we have in our minds of Europeans coming and enslaving people in their own villages is completely erroneous. If anything, it's the Arabs that were doing this in places like Iceland.
So that's why history is so important. We get one narrative, we see it on TV, and that was what I grew up with as well, and I just assumed it was correct. But no, as you said, we don't have a documented case of Europeans going inland and taking people by force. But here we see Arabs going up via the pirating, because that was they were seafarers pretty much, and they would go up and they went into Iceland inland and took 400 people. 400 people, and only one of them returned, a girl that was rescued by King Christian. And then we see just 4 years later in Baltimore, Baltimore is a little village in Ireland.
This is not the Baltimore in America.
No,
this is Baltimore, Ireland.
This is the original Baltimore, which the Baltimore in America was named after. Baltimore, Barbary pirates came and they took the whole village. Not one person was left. I mean, this is just, imagine you go to bed at night and you wake up by hearing all this commotion. Next thing you know, you're on a slave ship, never to see Ireland again. It's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. So this revisionist history that we've been taught in schools, that we've seen in our films, is just so unhelpful. And another unhelpful statement is by your ex-president, Barack Obama.
Barack Obama,
Yeah.
What did he say?
He said this, when he did his first address in the Arab world, he said this at Cairo University. He said, the first nation to recognize my country was Morocco, which in some cases is true, but is missing out the whole story. They encountered the Americas through the Barbary piracy. And it was Thomas Jefferson who had to deal with it at the time. So American vessels are going out trying to trade and, trade with Europe, trade with Africa, whatnot. And they're getting intercepted by these Barbary pirates. And so Thomas Jefferson is like, what is happening? He goes and he speaks to the embassy, the ambassador of Tripoli, to say, we haven't done anything to you. We know that US was just a new country now. They weren't involved in any of the crusades. They weren't involved with any wars against the Arab world. Nothing to do with the Arab world in a negative way. Yet their ships were being enslaved. Their people were being taken into slavery. And
it's fascinating because if you look at the Marine Corps hymn,
yeah.
I was a Marine.
Yes.
And we used to have to sing. And the first two lines are, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
Well, there you go.
It was the Marines that actually shut down the slave trade.
Yeah.
It was the American Marines that finally had to be sent over to North Africa to shut down that slavery.
Yeah.
And it's in it's our hymn for the Marine Corps, because they were the ones that actually did it.
Yeah, they did it because, well, when Jefferson spoke to the ambassador, he got a response back, which was very interesting. It was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged Islam's authority were sinners, that it was their duty, so the Muslims' duty, to make war upon them and to make slaves of all they could as prisoners. So this is before Thomas Jefferson gets the presidency, but he thenceforth gets the Quran to read it and is alarmed. And as you said, he sends in the Navy, he sends in the Marines to deal with them. Mm-hmm. Hurrah! Hurrah. In 1815. So we can see, again, another nation who had not interfered with the Islamic world, had not been involved in the Crusades, had not done any sort of offensive attack against them, were getting attacked. So we're seeing that jihad is not defensive, it's offensive, and along with jihad always is the slavery. Mm-hmm. And so we see Muslims now enslaving people from Iceland, from Ireland, from the US, and in England as well, many places. But
what kind of numbers are we looking at here? Let's look at the slide, because you've got them in here.
Yeah.
We're talking about over 1 million.
Over 1 million, and some estimates go up to 1.75 million.
Yeah.
We've kept the conservative estimate there.
And this went from 1528 to 1780. So this was not a short time. You're talking about over 200 years here.
And this is overlapping the transatlantic slave trade, which gives an interesting perspective to what was going on in the world.
Wow.
You have the transatlantic slave trade going on at the same time as you have people from Europe being taken into slavery as well. And there was an emphasis on humiliation as well, making people bend down and bow and stripping them naked when they're taking them into slavery. It's a very Islamic thing to do, when people are meant to be paying jizya in Islamic worlds. They have to pay it with submission, they have to feel themselves subdued, they have to maybe take the pose of somebody who is being humbled before them. Yeah. And this was a feature in the slavery when it was done by these Barbary pirates. The amounts involved as well, it was so frequent that every parish in England pretty much had people who were taken into slavery. And
England?
In England.
I mean, every parish in England, somebody was in slavery.
Yeah, you go through the records and they're collecting money to get the ransom for these people, because these pirates would demand a ransom as well. And so there's estimates that more than £1 million in 18th century England was paid to ransom people back from Barbary pirates.
Now,
And
why
sometimes
haven't we been taught this? I don't know. I've never heard this before. This is the first time I'm hearing it, even here in Britain.
Yes, yeah. So even right there, we see in the picture an ordinance of the Lord and Commons. So this was in Parliament, they're talking about it. They're talking about these distressed captives and how we're going to raise the money for these distressed captives. Who's the one who's going to do the raising of the funds? Do we have enough funds? Can we get them back? Sometimes people were ransomed several times. They'd pay the ransom, they'd be caught again, they'd have to pay another ransom. It was very expensive. It was bankrupt in England. It really was.
My goodness. Okay, so this is a whole chapter we've not been told about. And why, I wonder, is this not being talked about?
It's just been wiped out of history, unfortunately.
It's just been whitewashed.
Yeah.
There is an embarrassment here, but that's fascinating that you're bringing this up. Now we're going to move to Spain, because Spain, this is particularly our particular problem, wasn't it?
Yeah, so with Spain, this has been held up to be one of the beautiful, glorious periods of Islam in Europe, where Europe kind of flourished under Islamic rule. But we find it's not necessarily the case, and it was just as brutal as any other period of Islamic slavery. We find there that it became the center of trade actually under the Umayyad period. So where people wanted to go and buy slaves, they would go to Spain, especially white slaves. The European slave trade, when we're talking about the European, I mean the Islamic European slave trade, where you would buy the white slaves.
You've got the slide up there, you can see.
Yeah, where you would buy the white slaves.
And you can see they had different prices depending if they're male, female, white, uneducated, and white who's a singer.
Yeah.
So if you're a singer, you're a lot more expensive.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at Spain on a map, you have the intersection of Europe and Africa and not so much Asia. So we're talking about white slaves, black slaves, majority white slaves, but you needed to be able to afford the white slaves. They were worth considerably more. So a dirham is a silver coin, whereas a dinar is a gold coin. And you can see the black males are worth the least. You get a bit more for the black female. But the white girls, it goes straight up there to 1,000 dinars. That's 1,000 gold coins.
Oh, now this is really, I didn't realize the dinar is more expensive than the dirham.
Yeah.
So the blacks are nothing.
No. Well, the black females is 300 dinars.
So what does this say? Tell me, what's this? I mean, I can see where this is going.
Yeah.
Really, this is for sex.
Yeah, it's for sex. It's for it's how they attributed value. So remember when we're talking about colorism and how the Quran and the scholars of the Quran talks about black people. We see it here in their pricing structure. They priced the black slaves much lower than they priced the white slaves. So we see that here.
But I'm looking at male-female.
And the male-female, yes, yeah. So we remember the males, they would have castrated them. So they were just like security guards, or they were there to do menial stuff, or, just stuff around the house, whereas the women you would use for pleasure.
Look at the black male and black female. The dinar, the woman, black male, female, is much more expensive than the black male.
Yeah.
Whereas with the Atlantic slave trade, it was the males they wanted because they needed them
the work.
For the work. They needed them in their big plantations.
Yeah.
In South America.
There was a sultan in in Morocco, who had 500 wives and thousands of concubines. You could see that the whole purpose of this particular slave trade, the Islamic one, was more about sex, was more about pleasure. And if you think about their idea of paradise, going to paradise and just having all these 70 versions.
Paradise on earth.
Yeah, he's got all these 70 versions and, endless houris. We're seeing that right here.
Oh my. I hope you're all watching this, because this is something that has not been brought up in our history books. This is something we're not taught about. And yet we have noticed that with Islam, an awful lot of Islam is based on male only. If you look at the Quran, it's all for males. If you look at paradise, it's all for males. And what's there for the females? Well, they're subservient. They must be dressed completely covered. It's the females who are the huris. They're going to be in heaven, in paradise, waiting upon the men. According to some tradition, every man will have 72 of these huris. And we're seeing it also here in the slave trade. Yeah. The slave trade is evoking that as well.
Yeah. And
they're putting the female above the male as far as importance.
Yeah, and you'll notice with the male, as you just said, Muslim women, it's important for them to be covered. And with the slaves, they said, you only need to be covered from the waist down. So these women were often walking around topless. And this was their status as slaves, as people that can just be used for sexual pleasure. So we see this especially in Egypt and around in the Muslim world. And if you look at the pictures, some of the paintings that we see of Islamic slavery, the women are generally naked.
Topless.
Yeah.
Hatun loves to put those pictures up in her whenever she goes it because it's so glaring, it's so jarring for us, and yet that was quite normal.
Yeah, you'll see the
sultans.
Because
that was the category.
Yeah.
Women were there for sex, to take care of the male's needs, and slaves all the more so. Because you could have as many as you want according to the Quran. Mm-hmm. Remember, the Quran says only 4 wives in Surah 4, Ayah 3, but in Surah 4, Ayah 24, that which your hand possesseth, you can have as, there's no number.
There's no number.
Which means slaves would be your concubines.
And that's the only way you can get them is through
conquest.
War. Yeah, through conquest.
What your right hand possesses.
So no wonder they're going out to all these different places because that's the only way they can get these slaves. So they're entitled to religiously.
This is a whole way of now looking at the Quran. Why is it you're looking at if it's there in the Quran, it's no wonder then that this becomes part and parcel of the culture. Yeah. The culture is reflecting the Quran, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's morally, according to Islam, there's nothing wrong with it. Even though it's blatant adultery, it's blatant fornication, according to Islamic theology, there's nothing wrong with it.
Adultery, you get 100 lashes. You do not have a play with another woman who's not your wife. But you can have as many women as you want.
Yeah.
As you say, the Sultan, how many did you say
he had 500 wives.
500 wives.
And countless concubines.
Countless concubines. So, again, you take the Quran as your basis and you take it as your foundation. Can you then understand why this is just the slaves are the ones, you can see why slavery was absolutely needed.
It was.
Now we can understand why there's no progeny.
Yeah, and even with that example of the 500 wives, people can come back and say, well, Islamically, he's only allowed to have 4. Fair enough, he can call the rest his concubines. It's absolutely fine. There's no issue in that with Islam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, and then you did mention also the difference in white versus black, but what's really fascinating is the uneducated versus the singer. They like singing.
Yeah, well, it's entertainment.
Entertainment.
So it's entertainment. So if you're a rich person, then you could have your singer slave. You can have the slave that makes your dresses, the slave that you keep for pleasure. You can have the slave that juggles,
So they would also enhance the price of the slave by doing other things.
Yes, yeah, and you get better treatment as well if you could do other things.
But you've got here that they would lighten the skin?
Yeah, so if white skin or lighter skin, you get a higher price for it, then the slave traders would do their best to lighten the skins of their slaves. So we have it documented that Islamic slave traders used to do that. They used to rub ointments on the skins of black people or of even if they were darker to try and make them lighter, make them as white as possible. And to contrast this again with the Houris, we see in the Islamic literature that the Houris, what is their skin like? It's white. It's so white that it's see-through.
Pale.
It's so pale that you can see their bones through it. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing Muslims trying to recreate paradise
on earth. Fascinating. And they would even color the hair.
They would color their hair because the blonder, the better. So they would try it.
Well, that's fascinating. So you can, you've got the pictures there of.
Yeah. So this is just a Jamaican music artist, and it's so embedded in some, even in parts of the Caribbean now, in parts of Africa, in parts of Asia, that the skin lightening is really important, even though it damages their skin. You can see that this has not been good for him at all.
This is the same character on the left and the right.
It's the same person, but he felt that he looks more beautiful or he looks more handsome with lighter skin, and it's an epidemic. And we can see that if this has been going on for, well, we said 1,400 years. Imagine what that does to the psyche.
It just goes from generation to generation.
You just start to internalize,
And they had all these ointments on the product. Then they also had these hair straighteners that they had there. And I felt it just felt tragic because it was blighting their skin, and they would have all kinds of reactions to these ointments. It wasn't good for the skin at all, as you can see with this man here.
Yeah. So it's in the psyche. Remember when we looked at the poem where he started to internalize, even though I'm black, inside I'm white, this has been internalized. And so it's good to discuss these things to find out where these ideas came from.
Well, now we go from Andalusia, and we go from Barbary pilots, and we go from Iceland and England and Britain. Now we move to Asia.
Yeah.
Because this also existed in Asia.
Yeah, especially in India, they called it Sind. They called it Sind.
Before the British came, this was all one country, including what today would be Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and also Afghanistan would be all part of the Sind.
Yes.
So we have a picture up there, so you can see it on the map there. This is from 770 to 810. Dharmapala. Go ahead and look and tell me what we're looking at there.
So we're looking at Islamic invasions of this particular part of India. And you mentioned the British rule. Two very important rules over India, the British and the Islamic. And the Islamic lasted a lot longer.
The Mughal Empire.
And we can go from the 8th century, looking at Muhammad bin Kazim. We've got that on the next slide. And he's from the 7th century. He led his armies to invade India. Again, India had not gone to the Arab world. They had not interfered with the Arab world at all. They're minding their own business. And this Islamic army launches an offensive attack on them. And they kill thousands, they take thousands as slaves. Tens of thousands, it says here, were enslaved. And so we see that right from the 7th century, and we see it going all the way up. So India has been overtaken by Muslims in British England, but when we look at the way history is taught, we only focus on the British occupation.
Which didn't enslave anybody that I recall, but they did control the country. They didn't enslave them. What they did is they brought in, having grown up in India myself, they brought in hospitals, they brought in schools, they brought in railways, they brought in entire road systems, they created an entire governmental structure, administration structure, got Indians into that structure. So when they left really this legacy behind, quite a bit different than what we're talking about here. So when the Muslims came, they really did enslave them.
They enslaved, they raped, they took people from India back to places in Arabia and different places. And they killed many people. Boys of fighting age, they slaughtered many of them. I think we see here in the 11th century, Al-Utbi, he records that after the Battle of Peshawar, this is just right at the beginning of the 11th century, he said 100,000 youths were captured. 100,000 youths. And they were taken as slaves, and the value dropped right down to 2 to 10 dirhams each for these slaves. They just enslaved that.
There were so many that it shut the price down for them enormously. So you have them from 2 to 10 dirhams only.
And we think about when we're talking about the African slave trade, or the slavery that was in Andalus, the black slaves were 200 dirhams, the black males, and that was very, very low compared to the white females. This is a fraction of that. This is an absolute fraction. And so yes, we know that the British did very good things. We know that there was some very terrible times as well. But the way we tell history completely discounts the Islamic component as well, and what it did to the country way before the British came. And this is something that needs to be looked at.
Well, I don't recall of any case where the British ever enslaved anybody.
No, they didn't enslave, but there was some economic stuff and hunger issues and I'm trying to figure out. I mean, I've studied Indian history. Not enslaved. Nothing comparable to this. Not enslaving.
They would sell people for dinars and dirhams, 100,000. Why haven't we heard
there
this
was
before?
Nothing like this. I mean, this is just. It's far worse. For your value to drop to that, what does that say?
Okay, you're going to talk about the city people in particular.
So these were people who were taken from Southeast Africa. And they were brought to India as well. So there was a mixing, and the way people think how colonialists acted in the world and decided where lines would be drawn and which people would live in this place and who would live here and who would live there. Well, the Islamic empires did it as well. They moved people from this place to that place and ruled the world as they thought. And so we shouldn't really have this idea that it was only Western cultures that colonized.
Fascinating. I've never seen anybody do a comparison between Islamic colonialism and European colonialism. We've only heard about European colonialism, and it's seen as a black mark on the whole history of Europe. It would be fascinating for someone to do a comparative back and forth.
It would be really great if they went country by country.
Now the city people in particular, so these are the people they were brought from Southeast Africa by Arab and Portuguese slave traders.
They were working in cahoots.
Look at that. To the Indian subcontinent in the 14th. And so their descendants still exist today. They're an ethnic group in India and Pakistan. Okay, I've not come across them before. Having grown up in northern India, I wouldn't know about them. Well, this is a whole new chapter. This is a whole new idea. This is new for me. I've never heard this. This is all new history that I've not come across. Sarah, thanks so much for doing this. I never thought of European slavery, and yet that's exactly what Islam did. They enslaved British, Icelandic, American, right across the Mediterranean. The Barbary pirates, I've known them, but I didn't know what they were. Now I know. And then, of course, going to India. And the fact that, fascinating, when you looked at the list of prices, how that women were more expensive than men.
Yeah.
Why? I've never thought that through. But in an Islamic context, it was really for sex. This was all to do with sex. And that's why you can now understand why no families were created, why there's no progeny, why we can't see, according to John Azuma, 120 million of them should be around today. They aren't existent. We don't see these families. We don't see these populations like you do in the Americas, South America, and in America, my country, where there's about 30 million Afro-Americans because of the progeny that existed of the European slave. They wanted families. They wanted them to progenate. Not so in the case of Islam. They only wanted the women. The men they castrated or they got rid of. They just didn't enslave. They just destroyed them and kept the women for their own pleasure. Listen, this has been kind of heavy material. We're sorry that it is heavy, yet this is history. We've got to understand it. We've got to unpack it. We've got to see what formulates it. We're then going to go in the next episode, which will be episode 11, we're going to look at the abolition. How did slavery finally end? Stay with us. This is Jay then, and Sarah here in London. Over and out.